and welcome to Introductory Cello. Today we're going to talk about how to get started. So first and foremost, we're going to talk about how we sit when we look at the instrument. This is a cello, this is a bow. We're going to put that down for a second. This is a chair. We have to sit in the chair to play the cello, and there are straps you can use to stand, but most of the time people just sit and play because it's what's most comfortable. You know, you have most control over the instrument. So when we sit, we want to make sure that our knees are wider than hip width apart and our feet are flat on the floor. So that way we have a place for the instrument to rest. Ideally, you want the two ends, right here, you want these two ends to be kind of nestled in between your knees. So that way it's nice and solid, it's not going to move around too much on you. And you want to make sure that this part of the instrument right here is nestled right here in your chest. So that's something that makes it feel solid. That way, when you are, playing stuff, we want it to be moving around on you too much. That would just stink. So when we talk about how we should be sitting, we're talking about feet flat on the floor. We're talking about, knees wider than hip width apart, but we also want to make sure that we sit straight up, almost as if we're standing. So we want to make sure that we have what feels like a string in the center of our brain being pulled directly upwards, so we sit up instead of slouching like this. Because when we slouch like this, it doesn't. Then we end up with all kinds of back problems and stuff. So we want to make sure that we sit straight up, so that way being pulled like a string. So that is a good way to think about it. And then your shoulders relaxed. Everything's got to be relaxed, so that way we know that we're not going to hurt ourselves, but we're making sure that we can feel comfortable with the instrument that we're holding. So up next, we're going to talk about plucking, the first, experience in making sound on the cello. So, there's two different ways to play. You can either play using just your fingers, or you can use a bow, which we'll get to. And when you use just your fingers, that's what we call, it's an Italian word called pizzicato. And it basically just means to pluck the string. So when you pull the string and it makes noise. When you do that, you want to take your fingertip, either your pointer finger or your middle finger, depending on, what you're going for. And you pull the instrument, or pull the string away from the instrument. But you don't want it to pull too hard, because you don't want it to be smacking against the fingerboard like this. Unless that's indicated, but we'll get to that later on in our lessons. So first we want to start with just pulling the sound out of the instrument using your hands. And when you're holding the bow and plucking, you just kind of want to hold the bow with like these three fingers, not touching the hair, but that way you have your two fingers ready to go. You can place your thumb on one side and pull the string away, same as if you're holding the bow or not. A really fun way to just practice scales is by plucking, because then you can focus on where your hands are. And you can focus on keeping your plucking consistent. So that's a good way to practice both plucking and scales without being too worried about what your bow is doing. Next, we're going to get to the very exciting, the bow. The bow is how we make the majority of our sound. It is the central place for where sound comes from on the instrument, where all the control comes from, basically. And you can do a lot of different things with it. You can, make it loud, you can make it soft, depending on where you place it. There's a lot of things that happen with this. So this is basically the key to having a good sound, is having control of your bow. And in order to have control of your bow, we have to hold it right. So basically what we want to do is we want to relax our hand like this, flop it around, shake it around a little bit. And when we have our hand shaken around, take a pointer finger and just push in the center of your palm like this. Just gently use the strength of your hand to push up, so you have a flat wrist like this, but you still have relaxed fingers. That's how you want to hold the bow. With violin and viola, it's a little bit different, but with cello and then French bow for bass, you want to make sure you have a flat wrist, but have an easy, nice, loose set of fingers for your top four. For your thumb, it goes in the crook of the frog like this, and it's going to be a little bit bent. So you want to sit your bent bow. I don't know if you can see that. You're going to make sure that the thumb is bent, and your fingers, you're eventually going to put the most of your weight in these two fingers, the pointer finger and the middle finger. So when that happens, you'll be able to hold your bow without using any of the other fingers if you have the other two. But so that's how you know that your fingers are relaxed. You want to make sure the bow is tight enough that you get enough leverage so you can push the stick almost down, not completely down, but almost down to because that's where you get your pressure from. So that's how you hold it, and then you can flip pretty easily by using the pinky, the ring finger to pluck when you need to switch to that. And so, if you watch my bow hand, this is what it looks like in action. Also, when you start down here, that's when you put the pressure into your pointer finger, because that's what gives you the good sound you want. But when you're here, that's when you need these fingers. So they do come in handy later on, so you don't want to have them just flying up and about, but you want to make sure that you have the control and the strength where you need it, and the support and the balance where you need it. So that is just kind of a summary of how the bow holds. And we will work on that more in lessons. This is just an introduction. As for making a good sound, somewhere between here and there on the instrument, basically between the edge of the fingerboard and the bridge, which is right here, you can't see it. In between the bridge and the end of the fingerboard is where the best sound is produced. So when you play up here, it's going to be a softer kind of, not as strong sound, not as full-bodied of a sound. And up here it's going to be much more bright and much more big and pointy almost. If you think about, a sound like poking at you, that's the closer you get to the bridge, the more pointy your sound is. If we're putting this in normal terms, or in normal, non-music words, we call that a bright sound versus like a dark sound. And the pressure, how much you use the weight in your arm to push down the bow, is also a big control of how much bow you need to use, so that way you can get a big sound without using a lot of bow. So the harder you press, so if I use a little bit of bow, or a little bit of pressure, and use the whole bow, I can get a pretty soft, kind of warm sound, but not something that has a lot of body to it. But I can also use a small amount of bow and use a slower speed to pull the bow across the string that will make a stronger, more impactful sound. So see, that sounds very different from this. That's how I was saying that's where all your control comes from. So depending on what your music is asking you to do, you'll have these, different techniques of getting the sound that you want to do. And depending on the era, et cetera, you have different ways to make the sound that you want. As for bow direction, usually downbeats, you end up with a down bow. And a downbeat is when, it's your first beat of any measure, is usually a strong beat. You want it to be more forward than, the second beat in the measure, which isn't always quite as emphasized. So you want that to be your down bow, and then your up bow to be, usually less, you want it to be less impactful. That can change, and that can, your bow control changes over time, so you can have both be impactful. It's really just what's more comfortable for you when you're a player, but when you're just starting out, it's easy to just kind of say, well, down bow for downbeat, up bow for upbeat. So it makes it easy. And you want to make sure that your bow is perpendicular to the string and parallel to the fingerboard and the bridge. That will give you your most even and consistent sound. Notice that when I did that, I stayed pretty consistent in where I was on the instrument with the bow, so it stayed consistent. If I do this, it's not quite as clear. So your angle of your bow and the direction of your bow definitely have a big impact in the way that you want your sound to be. So that is the overall summary of the cello. We'll get more into detail about all of those things when we start really getting into lessons, but that's all you need to know for now. Thanks for tuning in.